So we still got a lot of people coming in, Amanda. So
Right.
we'll give it a couple of more minutes.
Yeah.
You should be able to see those now.
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Everybody just hang tight with us for just a minute or two while we get everybody in and make sure they have an opportunity to view this. Looks like this is going to be the popular edition of this particular meeting. So John, while we're letting people in, can I test out my slides real quick? I just want to make sure it doesn't leave that screen when I advance.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, you can see my screen just fine.
Yep.
Okay. And it's still there, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure this is the first time I've done PowerPoint over Zoom, so.
Okay.
All right. Wait just one more minute, because we still got a ton of people trying to get in here.
Okay. It has slowed down, Amanda. So maybe we can go ahead and get started.
Let's do that.
Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm John McGill. My name is John McGill, and I am the training coordinator for the Animal Resources Program, along with some other responsibilities for our group. But as you all know, we wanted to have a AAALAC site visit prep with the iCook, and so that's why Amanda's here from the iCook, and I'll let her introduce herself a little further. But anyway, just to get things started, we're not going to take questions by microphone, so please don't unmute yourself and ask questions. Please do submit any questions through the chat, and we are recording this, and so we will make the recording available after this is over for anyone in labs or out in the research world at UAB who wants to review this content. And so please do, as I said, please do submit your questions to the chat. I will give those to Amanda at a good time. I'm not sure if I'll wait to the end or interrupt her at any point, but we'll figure that out as we go. So Amanda, I'm recording, and so you should be recording, and so we should be good to go. And I can see your slides.
Okay, good. All right, good afternoon, everybody. For those of you that haven't met me, my name is Amanda Watts, and I'm in the iCook office as the Associate Director. And so, you know, if you've been at UAB for a while, you've been through this kind of rigmarole before, but we do try to kind of give you the things to look out for when we have an AAALAC site visit on campus. And so I'm just going to go over some of the things that we've especially seen maybe in the past that people have had issues with or just were a little unsure of answers to give in the past. And so this is just a way for us to maybe trigger thinking about some of those things that you may not necessarily think about on a daily basis because you've just been doing them for so long. It's just ingrained in you. And when somebody asks a question about it, suddenly, I don't remember, you know, how that all got started. So not going to try to keep you too long today. As John said, if you have questions, please enter them in the chat. Or if you think of something after the fact, please be sure to shoot us an email. And as he said, we will try to post this on the website if you want to review it, or if you have anybody else in your lab that couldn't make it today and couldn't make it last week to the in-person version of this talk. But let's go ahead and get started. So just for those of you who may not be familiar with AAALAC or have not been through a site visit before, AAALAC is essentially an accreditation group, and they have this nice long acronym that I've spelled out for you. Accreditation is a way that we kind of show our excellence in our animal care and use program for research. And the group that we are accredited with is an international group. They accredit institutions from around the world, and I forget how many how many countries they now have accreditations in, but it is growing by leaps and bounds as everybody in the research community starts to recognize that this is a great way to keep our thumb on how well the programs are functioning. But a lot of you may not understand why accreditation is so very important. As I kind of mentioned, being accredited means that we are being held to the highest standards of quality, and the standards that we're being held to for our animal care and use are the highest out there. So we do have lots of federal regulations. We have lots of rules and regulations that are passed down to us from our granting agencies, and just other things that we have to adhere to throughout the US. However, accreditation means that we're not only meeting all of those general federal regulations and laws, we're kind of going a step above and beyond, in that we're also comparing ourselves to best practices throughout the world now, since it is an international accreditation group. While that's important, obviously we want to do the best by our animals that we absolutely can, which means that we're also going to be doing great research. There are also some more practical reasons why it's important for us to be accredited. One is that many of our funding agencies, NIH being a very important one, require us to maintain an accreditation in order to continue to receive grant money. Another big part of remaining accredited is that a lot of our collaborating institutions require that the other institutions they work with also be accredited. So A, it kind of keeps the money flowing into UAB, and B, it continues to allow us to work with our peers around the country and around the world on our research projects. So accreditation is very important on many different levels, but those are kind of the three main reasons why we want to stay accredited. So the question I always get whenever we see, or whenever we talk to people about the site visitors coming around and either visiting the labs or visiting the animal facilities, is they want to know, what are these site visitors looking for? What are they going to ask me? And a lot of times when people start thinking about what these site visitors are looking for, they tend to get real deep down into the weeds. And honestly, the site visitors are going to be looking a little bit from a 5,000-foot view perspective, in the sense that if they walk into a space and they see that it's neatly organized, they see that everything kind of has its place, and things are in general are in date and kept very well organized, and the people are there to answer questions, that right off the bat gives them a really good impression. They're not going to tend to dig much deeper. When they start to see problems, when they start to hear inconsistencies, that's when they're going to start drilling down. However, in general, you don't really have a lot to worry about on your end if you're adhering to kind of two main principles. And just so you know, I gave this same talk to our ARP care staff because they need to know what's expected of them. But I'm also giving this talk to you guys with a slightly different tone. And so for research staff, two of the most important things I can tell you is know your AAALAC protocol, know what's been approved on it, what you're allowed to do. If it's been a little while since you've laid eyes on it, now is a great time to take the opportunity and review it, and to review it with other people in your lab. So everybody is working from the same notebook in a sense. And then just make sure that the people who are in your lab are currently listed on those protocols. We can ensure a lot of things from that. By them just being listed on the protocol, that means that they've received all of the required training that they need, that they're enrolled in the health program, and that they are able to have the access to the facilities that they need. So right off the bat, that clears you of a lot of different compliance hurdles just by making sure that you've got people listed on the appropriate protocols and that they know what's approved in those protocols. One of the big things that we run into, especially when these site visitors start visiting your labs, and of course, investigators are always really excited to then be in the lab and talk to the site visitors. The problem comes in is when a lot of those investigators aren't the ones that are in there day in and day out doing things and may not always remember exactly what's in their protocols because they're not handling them on a daily basis. And so sometimes they'll get asked a question that they don't really know the answer to, and sometimes they just decide to wing it. And that's not always a great idea. We've had a lot of people get themselves in trouble because they didn't know the answer, but they felt like they needed to say something. And just so everybody knows, it's really okay to say, I don't know. That is an acceptable answer, and the site visitors will be just fine with that, especially if you follow up with, I don't know, but I'm going to find out for you and get back to you. That is perfectly acceptable. They do not expect everybody to be an expert on everything. So please, if you don't know the answer, don't try to come up with something right there on the spot. So this is just a little bit of an overview of a few of the topics that we're going to cover. I'm not going to, again, go into great detail about these, but I do want to give you some ideas to walk away with today so that when you walk back into your lab, what are some things that you can immediately right off the bat just take in just visually, or even just walking over to your animal space and just reviewing how you do things in that particular area. So we're going to talk about spaces. We're going to talk about the animals, documentation, some of our standard practices and procedures, safety measures, making sure that you're using materials appropriately, education and training, and then just what's expected of you as a research staff. So clean, organized spaces. Obviously, if you do all of your work within the ARP facilities, you don't have a whole lot to worry about here. Where the problems come in is if you are storing materials within the housing facility. I know a lot of PIs keep their own carts within the animal rooms, or they have dedicated shelves or whatnot that are there. It's really important. Sometimes those things can be in complete disarray. So if you are keeping supplies within the animal housing rooms, please take some time between now and the end of the month when the site visitors are here to simply go in, make sure things are at least cleaned off, wiped down. A lot of times those carts have a tendency to build up piles and piles of bedding and dust and other debris just because they aren't cleaned that often since they're not ARP's responsibility. And just make sure that things are organized. There are a lot of times I go in there and I just see piles and piles of cage card materials and all kinds of markers laying around and half-used styrofoam plates and conical tubes that are filled with some unknown liquid, things like that. Those are things that they're going to kind of hone in on and make sure they want things to be labeled. They want things to be at least organized and clutter-free so that they can move about the room freely and that things are fairly clean. Now, obviously, if you take animals to your laboratories, those are spaces that the site visitors do sometimes want to see. I can't guarantee that they will want to see all of your labs, but they do tend to choose labs to go and visit if live animal procedures occur there. You can apply some of the same principles there. They want to be able to walk into a space, and at the very least, wherever you're doing your animal work, that space should be fairly clean and free of clutter, organized, and things are kept out of the way, especially if you're doing surgery in your labs. They want to be able to see how you're maintaining that sterile field, so they don't want to see a bunch of stuff piled up and around that area where you're supposed to be working with your animals. And here's just an example. I know not everybody can designate a nice area like the one on the left in your lab for surgeries or other types of procedures, but that just gives you an idea that you have a set area, things are organized and ready to go for maybe your next procedure, and everything's kind of put back and in its place. We obviously don't want to see things like on the right-hand side where, it's old bench paper. You can see it's still stained. You've got various instruments laying out, whether or not they're clean or they're obviously not sterile. Syringes, that's a big safety no-no, just leaving those sitting around. And then obviously no food or drink in the laboratories, certainly where animal work is happening. And I believe EH&S would probably say it all, unless it's a designated space. But just to give you some idea what they're going to be looking for. When we talk about healthy and alert animals, this is a little bit more geared towards the ARP side. However, if you are providing the care for your animals in the facilities, even if it's just a special diet or water, these are generally some of the things the site visitors are going to be looking for: clean, clear cages, and there's very little odor in the rooms. Obviously, some animals are a little bit stinkier than others, and that's a given. But we don't want to walk into a mouse room and immediately get hit with a strong ammonia smell or anything like that. Adequate space for the animals, and there's normal movement. If you're adhering to our density policies, you've got nothing to worry about here. If you do have tumor studies or other things like that where mobility might be an issue for the animals, that is something that you want to keep an eye on, and is something you want to make sure that you have covered in your protocol if you're having to go beyond any of our humane endpoints that have been laid out in our policies. Food and water, again, if you're providing those, just make sure that you are checking on those regularly enough that your animals aren't running out of food or water, and that is being documented. We'll talk a little bit more about documentation later. And then, of course, enrichment and social housing, again, that falls a little bit more on the ARP side, but if you have exemptions, or if you are doing something that's non-standard in those areas, we just want to make sure that's being documented and it is in your protocol. So documentation, we were just mentioning this. Some of these categories are going to fall a little bit more on the ARP side, but things that you should be keeping aware of is, especially if you have a protocol where you're looking at a particular type of disease study where you've had increased monitoring, you want to make sure that that's being documented somewhere to show that you are checking on those animals at the approved intervals. Again, if you're doing any type of special husbandry in your rooms, if you've got special diet, if you're adding anything to the water, or any other type of special care cage changes, if you need to have that non-standard husbandry form posted in your room, it needs to be there, and you need to be filling it out as those checks or changes are done. For your research records, if you're working with rodents, there aren't a lot of requirements for how much documentation you need to have. What we minimally say is that at least in a lab notebook or somewhere in your records, you should be able to point to, for a particular cohort of animals, this is when we did the experiment, and this is what we did, and this was the outcome. It doesn't have to be on an individual animal basis. It is nice if you're doing surgeries to be able to at least show some of those surgical records, such as, you know, this group of mice had this surgery on this day. Here's our follow-up for our analgesia, and those types of records. Safety, there's not a lot of documentation on your end. However, if you do use controlled substances, just remember that you are required to keep those handwritten logs with the drugs wherever they are locked and stored. And then you are required also to keep those online inventories updated as well. For all other safety things, other things they may look at, if you have an eye wash in your lab, those typically need to be checked at least once a week. And so you want to have documentation of that. Safety showers are not something we see as much in the labs. However, maintenance is supposed to be looking at those at least once every calendar year. And then another big one I know people might be struggling with right now is keeping hoods and biosafety cabinets within their certification date. I know EH&S has been a little bit behind on getting around to recertify those. So if you are having problems, if you have one that's out of date in your lab, and especially if you need to use it with your animal work, but you're having trouble getting them out to your lab, please let us know, and we'll see what we can do to try to help that process along.
Hey, Amanda, I'm going to break in. We got a question. Is it okay if these records are electronic in nature?
Yes.
For surgery checks and food checks?
Yes, it does not matter how you're recording it, whether it's in a lab notebook, whether it's a binder with pre-printed, formatted forms, or in its electronic database. As long as you've got those records there somewhere to kind of show how particular groups of animals were used. Again, it doesn't have to be on an individual animal basis if you're not using covered species. That is more than sufficient for your records and documentation.
Okay. Second question. Our lab has one cage of animals that appears to be very sensitive to change just before pups are due. Is there a way to communicate a one-time deviation from cage change 1 or 2 days from scheduled changes without having a non-standard husbandry form?
If ARP is doing those changes for you, or if you already have kind of a an understanding with the ARP care staff that particular changes or particular cages are not going to be disturbed, but you're going to take care of them, as long as you have communicated that with ARP and either they're okay with you, perhaps you mark it off on the daily care sheet, unless they have indicated that you need to have separate documentation in the room, it should be fine. 1 or 2 cages here or there that have to wait a couple of days for a cage change is not going to be a major issue. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that one.
Okay, it's the question is documentation of cleaning frequency for cleaning of animal behavior areas that are outside ARP vivariums, such as behavior room in our individual labs.
If you can point to it being done on a regular basis, so in other words, if you state, particularly if it's a core, what we typically have them do is they state that after each group uses the equipment is sanitized. Or if you state that, you're going to come through and just do it, once a week, that type of routine cleaning outside of the facilities probably doesn't necessarily have to be documented. I think it's always better, safe than sorry, to go ahead and have that documented somewhere. But with it being outside of the facilities and there's not a real requirement or standard for how often it should be cleaned, I guess that's really kind of in your purview, within the lab's purview. But again, I always feel like it's better just to have something where you can note that it was done on this particular day.
Okay, another question says the drug logs are for controlled substances only, or
Correct.
for any drug that is being administered to the animal. And do we want to keep it in the animal rooms?
So the drug logs are specific to controlled substances. So those drugs that you have to order through EH&S, and they will give you the logs and you're required to keep all of that documentation with the drugs. Beyond that, the only other drug you would have to really keep any documentation about might be any analgesia that you're using that is not a controlled substance. So for instance, carprofen. It's important that you are noting somewhere, especially in your surgical log, perhaps, that those things are being given. But beyond that, no, you are not required to keep any type of drug log, like for your isoflurane, or certainly any of your experimental drugs, unless that's something specific to your particular study.
Okay, there's thank yous. So no more questions for now.
Okay. We can always come back to them. Let's see. There we go. Standard practices and procedures. So again, some of this applies to ARP. However, some of the things that you just need to be aware of is, obviously, if you have animals that fall into some of these categories, for instance, the ulcerative dermatitis, we know that kind of stretches across campus and across many, many studies. If you are not aware of what the procedures are, as far as once ARP notifies you and lets you know what action you need to take, you need to make sure that you're staying up with that, either that the vet staff has given you something to treat the animals with, or maybe they've given you a deadline that animal may need to be euthanized or removed from the study. Just make sure you're aware of what you are responsible for on your end if these are things that are happening within your colony. And if not, now's a great time to ask somebody and familiarize yourself with the process. Processes for notification, in other words, those emails that you're getting from ARP about sick animals, about overcrowded animals, know what those notifications mean and make sure that you're communicating with somebody when there is a problem. Obviously, for the overcrowding, would be great if those, if we were catching those before being notified. However, just make sure that you're responding to those and correcting the situation as quickly as possible. And for the animal health, just make sure you're communicating with somebody, even if it's just to say, we're going to euthanize this mouse or whatnot. Just make sure that you're communicating back with whoever is notifying you, so they know that you're going to handle it and it's not just sitting out there. Make sure now is a great time to familiarize yourself with any of the AAALAC policies or SOPs that you that are pertinent to your particular type of research. Some ones that I think everybody should be familiar with are the transportation policy. So if you are not aware, if you need to transport your rodents across campus or in public areas, you are required to have those cages in a secondary escape-proof container. That is not wrapping a yellow gown around the mouse cage. That is not putting the mouse cage into a paper bag. Ideally, a lot of people find those Rubbermaid containers very useful, because you can fit a few mouse cages and a couple of rat cages. All you have to do is drill a couple holes in to make sure there's ventilation. You've got a couple of handles. It's very easy to carry, or they're very nice to put on a cart. And if something happens while you're out on the sidewalk or you're walking down a busy hallway and you get jostled, you're not going to lose those animals, and you're not going to freak a bunch of people out when that cage hits the floor. We see all different methods of people transporting animals across campus incorrectly, but just know that it needs to be in a secondary escape-proof container. And then also ARP is always available to do transportation for you if you request it. Another big one is expired materials. We find these all the time, and we understand that here recently it's been a bigger problem because we had a lot of people that were off campus and not doing research for a while. And then when everybody came back, everybody was in a big hurry to get things started up again. And so maybe they weren't paying very close attention to some of those drugs that have expired in the meantime. So just now is a great time. If you've got drug stores, especially ones that you may not use all the time, just go through and make sure everything is within date. Anything that's expired, it would be great if it can be discarded. If it's something that has to be either manifested out because it's hazardous, or if it's a controlled substance that has to be returned, it's okay for you to have those things around. Just make sure that it is labeled as expired and that it is separated from your in-date drugs, the drugs that have not expired, so that it's clear nobody's going to accidentally grab something that's expired to use, and it's clear to anybody who may come into the lab, review your stuff, that those things are expired and not in use. Training requirements. Hopefully everybody is aware of how they received training here, but you'd be surprised how many people get shell-shocked when they get this question. But the site visitors love to ask people, so how were you trained? And hopefully everybody remembers when they first came on board that they sat and did tons and tons of online training. You may even, like me, date back to the days of sitting in a room and looking at a tiny little TV screen, watching videos in the AAALAC office. But you had initial basic training, the most basic information we could give you about AAALAC, about animal research, and about the species that you work with. But understand that's not the only training you've had here at UAB. Hopefully you've had training from people in your lab, you've had training from your mentor. You may have even worked with the vet staff from time to time to learn a new technique. Or you may have gotten a chance to do some of our in-person training. We're trying to do more of that, and we're hoping to expand it more since it seems to have a lot of interest. But just know that there are lots of different ways or opportunities you may have had for additional training. And know that we also do things like newsletters. We send out things over the listserv. And it's not just because we're bored and need something to do. We do feel that this is information that's important to you guys, and we want it to be out there for you if you need it. The rest of these things on this slide are really more of an ARP issue, so I'll just move on. Safety protocols and preventative measures. So we've talked a little bit about making sure that materials are in date, that they are not expired. That's a big one. The other one is making sure that they're properly labeled. So this can be especially important for any materials that you're storing maybe in the animal rooms on your carts or whatnot. We have a tendency maybe to put things into a temporary container so that's easy to use, and then we forget and leave that container within the animal room, and now we have this unknown substance that's sitting in there. And it could be something as innocuous as some, distilled water, but we don't know. When we work in research, we have no idea what that clear liquid is in that container. So we need to make sure that things are labeled. Some of the things we work with in research may not have an expiration date, but if it's any type of food item or something that's going to be used in or on the animal, minimally, we'd like to at least see an open date on that container, just so we know that that hasn't been sitting around for 5 years, growing gosh knows what kind of bacteria on it, just to make sure that it is something that's fairly recent. When we talk about equipment being available and accessible, just make sure in your lab that you haven't piled up a bunch of glassware or dishware or whatever over your eye wash. We want to make sure that if there's an emergency, somebody can get to that eye wash as they need to. Equipment's been checked, tested, and certified. We've already touched on this just a little bit. Just know those eye washes, it's best to test them once a week. And your hoods and biosafety cabinets generally are checked at least once a year. Emergency and disaster plans. This is something that ARP does have in place as a way to kind of triage and know how we're going to react. And this actually came in really handy with the pandemic. And UAB, of course, has an overall emergency and disaster plan. However, not a lot of people realize it's important for you as a laboratory to have your own plans in place, especially if you bring animals to the lab, especially if you are allowed to house animals in the lab. You need to have procedures in place in case something happens and your lab can't get into those animals, or that you have backups within your lab for people to come in and take care of those animals if something happens. So just again, another push to kind of have those things in mind as we move forward, because there's always the chance that we're going to have another big bad bug hit us in the coming years. All right, maintenance, storage, use of materials. Proper use of the substance and the materials in the facility in the lab. So just making sure that you have the proper cleaning materials available, making sure that you're using what is approved in the protocol. Again, that can be just making yourself more familiar with what's been approved in your protocol. Mixing solutions and dilutions. And I meant to mention this in the expired substance. So hopefully everybody is aware that if you are taking materials from a stock substance, and I'm talking specifically about drugs, mainly anesthesia and analgesia, if you are having to take that out and dilute it down into a saline solution, you should know that that diluted solution is only good for 1 month. It's technically 28 days, but we give you the month because that's easier to remember and keep track of. So just that's why it's incredibly important that you're labeling these containers and you're transferring any dates, but also making a note of when it was mixed because it's only good for 1 month. Storing materials. A lot of this is not necessarily going to apply to the animal labs, but just knowing that if it's flammable, it really should be in a fire cabinet. There are certain types of drugs that are used in animals that may need to be kept in the dark, light tight, wrapped a specific way, or it may need to be refrigerated or frozen until use. Keeping checks on those expiration dates. I just can't stress that enough because we find them every time we come around. And making sure that anything that is expired until it can be disposed of is kept separate and is well labeled. And again, just make sure that what you're using in your animals is in the protocol. Training, we've kind of already talked a little bit about this, but just remembering, you did have that initial training, you've had on-the-job training, or at least I really hope you have. And if there are always ongoing education opportunities if you have interest in them. And then the other thing site visitors will be looking for, I know if they want to come to your lab, we do try to give you as much advance notice as we can. And we will put out a tentative schedule right before the site visit to let you know what buildings we're going to be in what days. Because we typically try, if there are labs in the same building as an animal facility, we will typically try, once we finish with the facility, to then make our way up to some of the laboratories. But we don't always know exactly what time that is going to be, and we don't know exactly which labs the site visitors may want to go to. But we will try to call ahead and give you as much advance notice as possible. Now, we know it's a common practice that when you hear the site visitors are coming up, that you tell everybody to scram and just the lab manager or maybe just the PI is there. Now, that is completely up to you. However, the site visitors really want to be able to talk to the people who are doing the work. And if everybody knows what it is they're supposed to do, then that shouldn't be a problem. And, they want to be able to engage with the research staff. They want to be able to engage with the care staff. And so the most important things you can tell your staff if they're going to be present during that site visit is just know what you do and know why you do those things. So for instance, why do we always wear gloves when we handle the animals? Why do we have to transport animals in a secondary escape-proof container? Little things like that. And they're not things that we think about on a day-to-day basis, but these site visits are always a good way to kind of refresh ourselves on why those things are important. Don't be afraid to interact with the site visitors. Again, they're not here to rip apart every little thing about our program. Again, if they see that overall things look really good and people are engaging with them and talking to them, they're not going to dig much deeper than that. And a reminder, it's okay if you don't know the answer. Please just say, I don't know, but I will find out and get that information to you. And then the last thing I like to leave people with is be proud of your work. We know we have a great program here. We've been continually accredited at UAB since 1971. And we have no fear that we're going to continue that accreditation history or whatnot as we go forward. So be proud of your work, be proud of what you do with your animals. We know we have a good program and we want you to talk about it. We want you to engage with the site visitors about it. And they want to hear about it because not only are they looking at us to make sure that we're following the standards, but they're our peers. They work at other institutions. They're also looking for information to take back to their institutions to say, hey, this was working really well this way at this institution. Maybe we should try to implement that here. And they can also feed that information from their institution to us as well. So it's not always just they're here to tick off those boxes and make sure that we're following all the rules to a T. They're also just trying to get information and understand how we do things and why we do things. Just for that general peer review and the best practices sharing across institutions. So I think that's basically all I had for the talk. So John, are there any other questions in the chat right now that we need to address?
We don't have any questions right now. We'll give it a few more seconds.
Okay.
While we're waiting, we do have people from ARP online. So if there's a question, any ARP questions, you can submit those as well.
Okay.
So nothing's coming in. I'm going to assume that we would have gotten the question by now.
So again, if you think of anything, please don't hesitate to shoot us or our offices an email and ask. Kara will be coming around doing her regular lab audits, as many as she can before the site visit. So if you're scheduled to see her, great. If you want to see her but haven't been contacted, again, just shoot her an email. We'll be happy to come out and do a check if that makes you feel better before the site visitors come out. We do a lot of those actually. But other than that, just keep up the great work and just use, again, this opportunity to maybe look at some of the things that you don't on a regular basis in your lab or in your animal room or even on your protocol.
So we did get a question, will yellow scrubs and booties be back?
No. So the current PPE requirements in the facilities, as my understanding, is going to be carried forward. So right now there is no requirement for booties in the main facilities. If you do have a barrier room or maybe in like quarantine areas, it will be posted if you are required to have booties or additional PPE, such as the hair covers and face mat, or we should all be wearing face masks anyway, but gloves and things like that. Now you are required to have either a dedicated uniform or a lab coat when you are going into the animal rooms. So that will
Yeah.
still be required.
So along with that, there will be some animal rooms that still require booties.
Yes.
And that would be, I think you said that, but I was just kind of clarifying. I'm not sure. The next, there's a question, do cell culture biosafety cabinets, are they also certified by AAALAC every year? Cell
Well,
culture biosafety cabinets.
so IACUC doesn't do the certifications, EH&S does. However, IACUC and generally the site visitors aren't going to be interested in anything where animal work is not taking place, so live animal work. So if all you're doing is working in the cells and the petri dishes and things like that, and you're not actually injecting animals or anything in that particular hood or biosafety cabinet, then we're not going to have any interest in it. Now, if you're concerned because maybe that's out of date but you think they may still come to your lab, we're always happy to try to help and work with you to get EH&S up there to take a look at it. But in general, we're only really concerned from the animal standpoint.
What week is the inspection scheduled to be? It's March the 22nd through the 26th.
So the last full week of March. I think that's almost exactly 3 weeks out, 3 weeks from yesterday.
Yeah. And Amanda, just correct me if I'm wrong. Typically they inspect on the first 3 days. They're in the buildings.
Correct. So, and I don't remember exactly which buildings each day, but yes, we generally start facilities on about midday Monday, and we go through most of the day afternoon on Wednesday. Now we may finish up early on Wednesday. It just depends on how quickly things move. And generally, if they're not finding a whole lot, then things move a lot more quickly. Because again, if they're not seeing a lot of issues, they're not going to feel the need to dig any deeper. However, they can reserve the right on Thursdays to either come to labs, talk to researchers, or go back to facilities based on their documents review. So a lot of times on the end of the day, Wednesday, and most of the day, Thursday, they're reviewing documentation. That can be IACUC protocols, policies. It may be things that they noticed while they were out in the facilities and they've asked for information from the PIs, like if you have a particular SOP that you're following either for your sanitation, or if you have a particular SOP you're following for your humane endpoints, if you're grading on a system or something, they may request additional information for those types of things that they see throughout the facilities or by reading through the protocols. So it is possible that they may want to go out and see things on Thursday, but it's usually very little. Again, it's only a handful of things here and there.
Next question, are PIs expected to be in their lab space during the visits?
They are not required to. And in fact, I mean, unless they just want to be there for as a source of information, if you are not the person that is doing the hands-on work and managing the hands-on stuff in the lab, you are not necessarily the person site visitors may want to engage with. Remember, if they have questions about that, it really should be the people that are doing it hands-on. Now, we understand that some of them are students, you're going to have classes and other things. You may not be able to be there during that particular time. So if whoever's available can be there, that's great. But no, investigators are not required to be there, but they are more than welcome to be there if they can.
Next question, is this session available to watch again and where? And I'll use this to say yes. We're going to have a recording available. We'll send the link out through the listserv, and it will either be on the IACUC homepage or the ARP homepage. Not sure which one yet.
Or both.
Or both. That's an option too. So that's all the questions. That's probably a good place to stop.
Thank you, everybody. This was probably one of the best turnouts we've ever had for one of these sessions. So maybe we'll keep up with the electronic or the Zoom versions going forward. But again, if you think of anything, get in touch with us, or grab a care staff member when you're in the facilities and have a question, or contact our offices or whatnot.
Okay. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everybody. We'll get the link sent out soon. Amanda, everybody, you got a lot of thank yous coming in.
Oh.
It was helpful. So congratulations. You were helpful today. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.